Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Washington History Seminar, Historical Perspectives on International and National Affairs. This afternoon, we will be focusing on a new book by Princeton University political scientist G. John Ikenberry entitled A World Safe for Democracy, Liberal Internationalism and the Crisis of the Global Order, published by Yale University Press just several weeks ago. I'm Eric Arneson from the George Washington University, co-chair of the seminar and director of the National History Center of the American Historical Association. This seminar is a collaborative venture of the Woodrow Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program and the AHA's National History Center. And for the past 10 years, the seminar has been meeting weekly, usually if not always on Mondays. And since we're unable to meet in person in the nation's capital, we have migrated online to this webinar format. Behind the scenes are two people who make these seminars possible, Pete Bierstecker of the Wilson Center and Rachel Wheatley of the National History Center. I'd also like to thank two institutional supporters, the LePage Center for History in the Public Interest and the George Washington University Department of History, as well as a number of anonymous donors whose ranks we invite you to join. My co-chair, Christian Osterman, has turned over that role today to his colleague, Robert Litvak, Senior Vice President and Director of International Security Studies at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and I should add, has served on the National Security Council staff as Director for Nonproliferation in the first Clinton administration, and he's the author of Rogue States and U.S. Foreign Policy, Outlier States, and most recently, Preventing North Korea's Nuclear Breakout, and a number of other works. I'm delighted to be co-chairing today's session with Rob. One last point on logistics. Please be aware that our session is being recorded and can soon be found on our institution's respective websites. And when we get to the question and answer section of this webinar, we ask those with questions to use the raise hand function on Zoom. When we call on you, please be ready to unmute yourself. And to those watching on Facebook Live, you can email questions to rwheatley@historians.org. We'll try to call on as many folks as we can. And with that, I will turn over the screen now to my co-chair, Rob Litvak, who will introduce today's guest and begin the conversation. Rob.
Thank you, Eric. Thanks to my colleague, Christian Osterman. This is just an extraordinary series of meetings that are conducted under the auspices of the American Historical. And we're so appreciative of this collaboration. I thank Christian for letting me sit in his usual chair to serve as a discussant, that is a moderator with John Ikenberry in today's conversation about his new book, A World Safe for Democracy. John, I think, really needs no introduction to this audience. He's a professor of politics and international affairs at Princeton University. He has, with reason, been called the preeminent theorist of liberal internationalism. And the book that we'll be discussing today with him, his latest book published by Yale University Press, is A World Safe for Democracy. It is the third in a series of books that he's written, the first of which was written or completed at the Wilson Center when John was a fellow, After Victory, a brilliant book, which really answered one of the riddles of the post-Cold War era. Like, if you're a realist, you would have expected the whole world to have balanced against American power. A lot of us were focused on that, why that didn't occur. John provides, I think, a brilliant answer to why that did not come to pass, linked to his overall theory thesis that we're going to hear a lot more about today, about the embedding of American power in institutions and norms. Wilson was very proud to have supported, through John's fellowship at the Wilson Center, that book. After Victory was followed by Liberal Leviathan, another landmark publication, and today's book completing this trilogy, though who knows, the door may be open for a fourth volume, is A World Safe for Democracy. John finished this book last year while a fellow at All Souls College at Oxford, which is the preeminent, among the preeminent colleges at Oxford, where he was in residence working on this manuscript. With that introduction, let me begin, I think, at an appropriate starting point, John. Your book begins with a focus on the, quote, current crisis, close quote, of the US-led liberal international order. But it spends a lot of time looking back at the liberal international order of the last 200 years. what led you to look back and, quote, take the long view, close quote, of the arc of the liberal era?
Thanks, Rob, and thanks, Eric, for inviting me here and to hosting this event and to talk about this new book. And thank you, Rob, for that question. I think the book began really as a series of lectures at the University of Virginia in November of 2016. And very soon, with the topic of the current crisis of liberal order, you are faced with deeper questions, really world historical questions about not just the moment and the specific actors in Washington or elsewhere who are making decisions, but the broader moment that we're in as a global system. And so great questions are being asked. What is the nature of international order? This is a moment where people are going back to the classics, asking the core questions of international relations, reading Morgenthau, Carr, Polanyi, and classic things in the liberal tradition. What is the nature of the liberal democratic project of liberal democracy? Can capitalism and representative government be reconciled or brought back into balance? And what is the future of the liberal internationalist way of organizing the world? What are its prospects? And on what ground can we plant the flag of liberal internationalism? So with those questions in mind, I have taken the long view and looked back over the last 2 or 2.5 centuries, really, to the evolution and transformation, if you will, of liberal internationalism, making the argument that the liberal project or liberal order did not begin in 1989 or really even in 1945, but that it's had a longer arc of a kind of jagged history of golden eras and crises. The post 1989 era is in some sense an anomaly, that the earlier periods are much more agonistic moments of struggle, of close run things, particularly in the 1930s and 40s. And indeed, the book that sort of set the stage for my own project, one of them at least, was Ira Katznelson's great book, Desolation and Enlightenment, that looks back at the liberals after World War II who were picking up the pieces then, who were in their generation trying to figure out what liberalism, what liberal democracy could do in the aftermath of what was an avalanche of violence and illiberalism, the totalitarianism, fascism, the total war of World War II, the Great Depression, the Holocaust, the atomic bomb. And so in some sense, I've been inspired to look back and see that kind of larger history. And in doing so, I just to finish answering your question, there have been several different goals of this book. One is to get that larger history, that genealogy and the lineages of the liberal project. We've been here before. This is not something that is utterly new. That we've been through moments like this before. Secondly, in doing so, to convey a sense of the deeper roots, the kind of historical gravitas of liberal internationalism, sitting alongside other great traditions such as realism. And beyond that, trying to be honest about its accomplishments and failures, to kind of draw a balance sheet of over these decades and centuries, what has worked, what hasn't, how has it evolved, what has it as a project or as a movement learned. And then finally, to in some sense recast liberal internationalism as not an idealist tradition that in some sense wants to make the world better, but wants to develop ways, kind of pragmatic agreements and building order so that liberal democracy can survive. So to return to its more core agonistic, pragmatic, world-weary roots, and thereby giving more grist and substance to a tradition that obviously, as you suggest, is in a crisis, but that, as I argue, still deeply relevant to how we navigate the 21st century.
Thank you. The book's title is taken from Woodrow Wilson's famous phrase, "to make the world safe for democracy." But you think the phrase has a different meaning than what is commonly understood as a project to promote democracy around the world. How do you see this phrase?
I did use the phrase from Wilson, and in many ways it is the, if you were to kind of distill the essence as people understand it, and as it in some sense has been handed down from Wilson's day, a world safe for democracy, in his famous war speech to the Congress, has been understood as this a kind of call to spread democracy to all distant shores, a kind of crusade kind of aspect to liberal internationalism. And of course that's there. And I would say at the outset, liberal internationalism is a huge, sprawling tradition. And indeed, arguments are often who's in and who's out. Neoliberals or neoconservatives, are they in or out? And the contestation from within, and certainly contestation with rival traditions, realism and critical theory, and further left kind of revisionist critiques of liberalism, are all out there. And I often think Tacitus's the description of the Roman Empire, rich in vicissitudes, is equally relevant to the liberal and the liberal international tradition. But what Wilson is famous for arguing, or at least that's the implication people have taken from this phrase, is this effort to spread the freedom agenda, if you will, worldwide. But in a second reading, it can be seen more literally as trying to make the world safe for liberal democracy. So it's that deeper sense of trying to create a kind of international framework so that liberal democracies, as they have evolved over these various centuries, can find a way to solve their problems and survive. So a much more conservative, if you will, sense of trying to create a framework, an egg carton for eggs, a terrarium for orchids that are fragile in some sense, that you need to have an environment to manage your mutual relations as liberal democracies. Liberal democracy, if you sort of take the political tradition, is built around tensions and contradictions in values, liberty and equality, individualism and community, sovereignty and interdependence. And in many ways, the liberal international project is one of creating order. It's an order building project for creating institutions and arrangements so that these liberal democracies can find ways to balance and trade off their different values. And so there is a kind of deep sense of liberal democracy as a world historical movement to make a more perfect, to build a more perfect union, a kind of sense of a project that unfolds over decades and centuries, each generation passing on to the next generation the kind of activities that we associate with liberal internationalism, tied around core convictions about how the world works. So it's that kind of a sense of liberal internationalism in its core as a pragmatic, opportunistic agenda that's aimed at trying to make liberal democracies safe in a world that often has other things in mind.
Great. So just following on that, if you were to distill the essence of liberal internationalism, and you mentioned there are variants under that broad rubric, but for you, what is the essence of liberal internationalism? How would you define it?
Yeah, I would say it's a tradition of thinking and acting in international relations that emerged with the rise of liberal democracies. And it's, in some sense, their ideas and projects for building international order so as to survive the storms of modernity. So just to kind of illuminate or elaborate that point, in some ways, liberal internationalism has been defined by its other, if you will, its rival, realism. And realism is often defined as a way of thinking about international relations, both ideas about how the world works and how you should operate in the world, oriented around the problems of anarchy. And in some ways, what I'm arguing in this book is that liberals also care about anarchy, the fact that states are competitive and often don't wish each other well, but that there's also another phenomenon associated with the modern world, modernity itself, growing economic and security interdependence of modern societies driven by science, technology, industrialism, and that phenomenon has been at the heart of what liberal democracies are oriented to finding solutions to, well, global warming, growing problems of violence capacity, the proliferation of weapons, and you might say the current issue of our life today, pandemics, all of these problems of interdependence that are shared worldwide, but that liberal democracies have both a special capacity to work together. Liberal democracies have a special capacity to cooperate among themselves as like-minded states. And historically, they have found common cause to build order and to rebuild order after crises that create a kind of nucleus around larger forms of cooperation can be extended worldwide. So that's where I would put the kind of the center or the bullseye of the liberal international tradition.
Well, that's clarifying. You speak about Wilson, but you also argue in the book that actually FDR and the revolution of liberalism in the 1930s and 40s is where we should look for inspiration. I mean, you kind of play down Wilson, and why is that? I think that sort of follows on, like you just laid out what you've used major tenets of liberalism, liberal internationalism, and now sort of like linking that up with the major political figures of the 20th century. You say that FDR is more of a guide than Wilson. Do you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, the first point I would make is that, you know, in addition to kind of this framing of the problems of modernity are what unite liberals across the different eras, the rise of liberal internationalism is in some sense tied to what in the 19th century were really kind of disparate types of internationalism, the free trade movement, the peace movement, the parliamentary assembly movement, the arbitration movement led by jurists and others, and functional movements of regulating what is becoming global capitalism. These kind of came together, and Wilson, in some sense, was the end of the 19th century more than the beginning of the 20th century, in my view. That he was not an intellectual innovator in the tradition of liberal internationalism, but he gave voice to it. He provided a kind of synthetic bundling of those views, and he made it a political project, something that had a kind of movement quality to it. But in a strange sense, he saw the liberal democratic prospect actually he was quite sanguine really about liberal democracy building and becoming kind of the embodiment of what would become the modern world. So civilization, and the term civilization for him was similar to the term what we would call modernization, and he saw it as a global process that in some sense the deck was stacked in favor of liberal democracy. And so he saw the project of building international order as using the good news about liberal democracy as a source as the kind of source of glue for building a new type of international order. By the 30s and 40s, everything had gone sideways, and the 30s and 40s, starting with the Great Depression and the rise of illiberal great powers that were harnessed with all the technologies of modernity to do great damage and to engage in great aggression. And in that era, Roosevelt, in some sense, saw the problem of liberal democracy and international order in the opposite sense, that it was the international order that would provide the glue to hold liberal democracies together. And what you see in the 30s and 40s is, first, domestically, the New Deal and the other versions of kind of the looking for a new way to solve problems of industrial society that occurred elsewhere in the world. There was a kind of expansion, really, of the vision of what liberal democracy needed to do, the kind of rights and protections that societies had to build for themselves, and the kind of container, if you will, international container that would be needed to house these much more both vulnerable liberal democracies and liberal democracies that were now more ambitious about what they wanted to do, providing welfare and security for larger parts of the population. So this kind of double movement was deeply profound and innovative for thinking in the Roosevelt era. And so in that sense, as the book might lead you to believe, Roosevelt comes out as a bit of a hero in this story, providing a kind of revolution in liberal democratic thinking at home and abroad, and pointing the way to what would then, in the era of the Cold War, be even more expansive in the way in which the liberal democracies would work together. But it was really there in the crisis of the 1930s that the revolution in liberalism and liberal democracy and liberal internationalism occurred, a kind of liberal internationalism for hard times. And it's that era that I think is particularly important to look to as we look for a usable past, as we look for lessons for today's moment.
Let's jump ahead from Roosevelt to the end of the Cold War, because in After Victory, you talked about, a brilliant book. I commend to those who've not read it. Goes through all of the post-war settlements, going back to the Congress of Vienna right through. And you talk about what was distinctive about the end of the Cold War, how it ended, and laid out that argument. And now we are where we are, okay? So in a way, could you just talk about, I think that at this point, your book is going to be received in an environment and at a time when I think you'd acknowledge, and you explicitly acknowledge that there is a crisis right now about liberal internationalism as foreign policies are being renationalized around the world, among a host of other developments. So take us through, kind of that progression of how you got from the first book in your trilogy. I'm going to guess you didn't think you'd end up at this point in the third book of what has become whether it was intended or unintended trilogy.
Yeah, I do think that while the book, this current book, is trying to be as honest about what succeeded and what failed, in some ways the problems that we are coping with today are in some ways problems of success, the kind of post-Cold War era of globalizing the liberal project. In some ways, at the very moment when the Cold War ended, there was a sense that there was no other great, what Habermas called modernity project on tap, that was really this kind of final settlement of what in the great 20th century contest of how industrial societies and great powers in the world, how they would be organized. And so there was a sense of triumph, but in a kind of paradoxical sense, it was also the moment when the seeds of crisis were planted in several senses. The liberal, the markets and mobilization of societies and integration of societies across global space accelerated this moment. Countries made transitions and joined the order, and that was not. There are some who say, well, maybe if we look back, we shouldn't have invited China into the WTO. We may talk about that in our Q&A, but in some sense, it was a kind of the next phase of kind of this liberal vision of ever more inclusion inside of societies. The vote going from property, white male property owners to males, generally the right for women to vote, all the different kind of movements towards more openness and inclusiveness of liberal societies. In some sense, that was mirrored on a global stage with what was this sense that we are now opening up the world and the fruits of liberal modernity to a larger group of humanity, and that was all very good, but the kind of governance mechanisms broke down, and the kind of counter movements that began to emerge. And what I argue in the book is that the great moments of liberal order, or liberal international order, has performed most effectively on the global stage when it was in some sense a subsystem, when it was a club of democracies living in a world where there were alternatives. And so the so-called free world project, countries joining a community of democracies, if you will, with rights and responsibilities. It was like a mutual aid society. To be in was to have trade privileges and assistance with security. That, with the end of the Cold War, broke down, and the liberal order became less like a club, and as I argue in the book, more like a shopping mall, where everybody can kind of come in, and you don't have to go everywhere. You don't have to buy into, as you did before, a suite of rights and responsibilities and sign up to a set of values. You can come in and go to the Apple store, but not do anything else. So this sense of ad hoc kind of membership, and that, of course, degraded the governance structures, the bargains and institutions, more heterogeneity to the members, less agreement on social purposes, and then, of course, you get this sense of breakdown of those threads of internationalism that I mentioned earlier, that began to emerge and be braided together in the Wilson and Roosevelt era and after World War II, becoming unbraided. So the social democratic strand, what we often call embedded liberalism, gave way, but the neoliberal strand became more prominent. And so by the 2008 financial crisis, liberal internationalism looked less like it did to our parents and grandparents in the 40s and 50s and 60s, and more like a platform for capitalists and bankers to do deals. So losing that larger sense that we need to operate in a kind of community club-like way to create mechanisms for joint gain and management of our interdependence, so as to elevate the political order to an order that's greater than simply managing anarchy. So that sort of higher kind of conditionality of membership and rights and responsibilities got eroded. And part of the task in the future is, if we are going to reclaim the vision of liberal internationalism, is to find a way to rebraid the different strands together, to make liberal internationalism more useful and serviceable for everyday people struggling with everyday problems.
There are a host of people on this Zoom meeting who work on Cold War history and the end of the Cold War, and I think you'll find your analysis very relevant. I mean, there are persisting kind of lively debates about how that was played, of whether this Clinton administration slogan of engagement and enlargement, whether it was really kind of manifest in US actions at the time, or rather you had realists in the 90s during the NATO expansion debate saying, just get the line as close to Russia as you can, enlarge NATO. You had sort of the realists and the liberal internationalists kind of both advocating NATO expansion, but coming at it from different directions. And it's sort of played out now where, we're at a point, there are books about, will there be a geostrategic crack up with China in the middle of the century or not? So as you've laid out the tenets of liberal internationalism, Could you talk a bit about realists and the group you call left revisionists? Because you do engage your critics. You concede a bit, but you also push back on their claims. Can you just, in terms of the intellectual, theoretical landscape here, kind of differentiate the liberal internationalist kind of vein of thinking from the realist school?
Yeah, I mentioned realism already, but let me just say a little bit more about the engagement. It's not, the book is not a kind of a battle between liberalism and realism. And in fact, I argue that in some sense we have slightly different enterprises. One, realism, the problems of anarchy, liberalism, the problems of modernity. Even though liberals do care deeply about anarchy, and some of the great icons of realism, Morgenthau and Carr, had important things to say about how modernization of societies were altering public ethics and industrial society, and in the case of Carr, the kind of viability of small nation states. So there are lots of crosstalk between the traditions. I think liberals are in some sense, it's a more contingent theory than realism. Realism says that they can explain interstate relations wherever there is anarchy, ancient, modern, or elsewhere. Liberal internationalism is a slightly more modest argument that it wouldn't make sense to talk about liberal internationalism if liberal democracies did not rise. So the Enlightenment and the age of democratic revolution set the stage. I think liberals are not as certain, although there's great variation between different, both within any existing generation of liberals and liberal internationalists, about how powerful modernity is moving us to a better world. There are the end of history positions, and there are, you mentioned All Souls College at Oxford, where I was, Isaiah Berlin's much more agonistic version of liberalism, where, as he says, history has no libretto. We don't know what the future holds. We do know that we have values that we want to defend, and freedom, and so we do what we can. And Judith Sklar, a kind of liberalism of fear. So there's a lot of variation, but generally speaking, liberals are perfectly willing to concede the realists that the world could be driven entirely by power politics, unless there are efforts by states, liberal states in particular, to build agreements and to make contracts that you have to kind of move in a kind of constructive way to overcome those problems. And there's also a kind of normative kind of element to liberal internationalism. There's arguments about the way the world works, but there's also arguments about the kind of world you would like to live in. And again, I'm in sympathy with those efforts. The other thing I'll say, which gets us to we'll call the critics on the other side, you might say, the revisionist critics, who see liberal internationalism as failing not in managing the problems of anarchy, but failing in providing social justice, that it's a kind of moral failure. It's still a kind of a worldview that wants to promote cooperation, but it's perfectly willing to reconcile its agenda with global hierarchies of power, and even in the 19th century, racial hierarchies. Just take a close look at Woodrow Wilson. My answer to that in the book is to say yes and no. Yeah, that is true, but also we confront, in some sense, a paradox that liberal internationalism is simultaneously capacious as an intellectual view of the world. The world's horizons are vast. The universalisms are under the surface, but it's also a politically and shockingly thin political project that requires others to be in alliance with you. And so liberal internationalism is not a movement that will galvanize the world on its own terms to move us to a better place. It has always had to rely on allies. And so it was moved from the 19th century into the 20th century on the backs of nationalism, capitalism, great power politics, empire and imperialism, and Anglo-American hegemony. So it's always kind of almost like it needs a host to rest on to help it move forward. And in that sense, this is both its strength and its weakness. It's more, liberal internationalism has had a more profound impact on the modern world because it's been tied to empire and hegemony and capitalism and great power projects, but it's also made its hands dirty in some sense. It's compromised in various ways. And that's my answer to the left critics who see it as too complicitous with empire and racism, sexism. The answer is yes, it is, but it's also articulated principles that even in a deeply flawed liberal international order provide a kind of set of ideals that around which political struggles with liberal internationalists as allies can take up those struggles with others to bring that order closer to its ideals. So that it's a kind of it's a kind of story of yes and no, that it's never been all that it might want to be. Liberal states have never, ever, no liberal state has ever acted in world affairs simply on the basis of liberal principles. Hypocrisy is inherent in talk about human rights and social justice. Yet it sets, like the American system itself, it sets out ideals that are only imperfectly realized, but sets a kind of agenda for intergenerational struggle and passing on the project to the next generation with an idea that we can, in fact, do a little bit better.
I think that one last comment and question before turning back over to Eric. I mean, your point about liberal internationalism as a framework for managing a set of relationships and how it's been over time. There's been hypocrisy and abuses. And the Wilson Center memorializes our 28th president, who, while espousing liberal internationalism abroad, was a segregationist at home. And Wilson Center deals with all aspects of Wilson's legacy, including that aspect of it. But he's associated with liberal internationalism. Your book doesn't, you address, but it's not, you didn't write your book as a debate with realism, but you framed it as sort of like anarchy and modernity. And, realism, without getting into IR 101 territory, doesn't really have an answer for a lot of questions. I mean, it describes anarchy and competitiveness among states. But when you look at the global disruptors, two of which we're living through right now, a pandemic and the harbingers of catastrophic, potentially existential climate change, they don't really have a good answer to that. In a sense, if we don't get, as a biosphere, get a handle on the anarchy, there's not going to be a lot of modernity there. And in that respect, I think you've got the better part of the argument, John, about how a framework with the flawed history and the contradictions that you've outlined, but at least it's a coherent set of ideas that allow us to structure cooperation among states, recognizing that self-interest is not out the door. And in this country, we have America First. In Britain, it's Brexit. There are counterparts to that in Russia and China. It seems evident that the problems we face transcend the bounds of any country asserting that they can just focus on their state sovereignty and tend to their own house. So within this context, and people have used metaphors like a pendulum. Do you view like the pendulum on kind of assertive sovereignty in the formulations we've seen from in the United States and China itself, et cetera? Do you see some hope for, if you want to follow through on the pendulum metaphor, the pendulum might swing back where there's a kind of a holy crap recognition moment where everyone is saying, if we don't get a handle on this as a biosphere, going to fry the biosphere and it's going to be inhabitable, by the end of of this century. Do you see any hope in that respect?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I do see hope. Taking the long view is kind of how I get to that position. In the 30s and 40s, you saw the kind of breakdown of internationalism, the return of aggressive nationalism and fascism, and yet there was kind of a slower evolving counter movement. Internationalism was being recast. I tried to tell that story a little bit today and in the book. Roosevelt was deeply conscious of the rising interdependence that was being manifest in the 30s. Indeed, he used the term contagion to talk about the problems of economic contagion. He used that language in his letter to the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944. And in some sense, we are in that world, as you say, in steroids. The modernity has always been a kind of, and it's seen more in the Roosevelt period than the Wilson period, as kind of a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde phenomenon. Modernity offers great technological wonders and possibilities for human advancement, but also for civilizational catastrophe. And the Anthropocene era that we're entering, the pandemics of the future, all the kinds of what used to be science fiction understandings of how our future may unfold. And in that light, you need more liberal internationalism than less. Realism doesn't give you any purchase. The realist lens doesn't see it. It sees states and anarchy. It doesn't see problems that afflict all states and require creative forms of reimagining our common space. So I do think that there is a possibility for a new age of internationalism, liberal internationalism, driven by, I think, two catalysts. One is what I think we may soon see as a narrative of failure of the alternative, of the kind of bellicose nationalism, America first kind of mentality is driving us to great danger, physical, individual danger. Our parents are endangered by this kind of way of thinking and acting in the world, and so to others. And so that's one of them. And then, of course, so a kind of danger of a kind of an internationalism based on a backlash to the backlash, if you will, a counter movement. And we've always, if you take the long view, had those kind of dialectics at work historically. And then, so kind of looking over the abyss, that if we continue on this route, we are all going to suffer. And then I think the second catalyst is this global warming is happening sooner than we thought. We feel it, we can see it. It's not just an abstraction. And of course, pandemics are the poster child for the view that if you were to boil down the essence of liberal internationalism, you cannot be secure alone, you can only be secure together. We are only as safe as the weakest link, the health systems in other countries, or quite frankly, the health system in our own country has an impact on other countries. So it's a two-way street. And so that kind of intellectual acknowledgement that we've got problems to solve leads you to ideologies of international politics where problem solving is at the center of the agenda. So I'm bullish on a renaissance, really, of internationalism in some form, reinvented, reimagined, more pragmatic than ever before, but there because of our mutual vulnerabilities.
Thank you. Thank you, John, very much. Eric, over to you to lead the discussion from here.
All right. Thank you. Before we open this up, co-chair's prerogative to pose a number of my own questions, if I may. And I want to preface my first question by making it clear that I'm an historian, not a political scientist. So I would ask for your patience in explaining across disciplinary boundaries a number of things. And so my first question centers on the very term and the concept at the book's center, liberal internationalism, and the very expansive definition you afford it, or multiple definitions. Under its banner, you write at one point, its proponents have, quote, championed free trade and laissez-faire, as well as social democracy and the welfare state, while others have justified empire and military intervention, and still others have promoted visions of global governance and the rule of law. Liberal internationalism has been used to defend racial and civilizational hierarchy and to inspire movements for self-determination and universal human rights, unquote. That's a lot of ground. If liberal internationalism is all of these things, or can be all of these things, many of them at odds with one another on the list, why insist upon a single term or a single concept?
Yeah, that's a great question, Eric. And I could see somebody having other, doing it differently. It is a capacious term. I defend it by arguing that it's actually the opposite problem. If you narrow it, you run into the no good Scotsman fallacy, that you define it by fidelity to a dogma or a narrow set of principles that determine whether you're in or out. And I've decided that what's more interesting is to look at its tensions and contradictions and evolutions across time, and to acknowledge that under its banner, liberal internationalists in the 19th century have both championed empire, and at later moments and in other guises use those same ideas to oppose empire. So I try to suggest there is a kind of core set of convictions that bundles these different strands of internationalism. Open trade and exchange between societies is mutually beneficial, that institutions and regimes facilitate cooperation, that liberal democracies have special capacities and interests in cooperation, and fourthly, that growing levels of and cascades of economic and security interdependence require more rather than less cooperation between these states. Those four convictions, I think, are at the core of liberal internationalism. The book tries to help you out a little bit, Eric, in disaggregating it into types of internationalism. So I've got 5 or 6 different strands of liberal internationalism that emerge in the 19th century that get bound together in the Wilson era. And I talk about imperial internationalism, Westphalian internationalism as two kind of macro forms of thinking about international order that are kind of alternatives that liberal internationalism has had to navigate. So liberal internationalism across the last 2 centuries has moved its projects from a world of empire to a world of nation states. So in the last 200 years, the world has moved from one ordering principle, empire. As late as the end of the 19th century, 70% of the world's population lived in empires, to the end of the 20th century when nobody did. And that transformation occurred across 2 centuries when liberal internationalists, from John Locke to John Stuart Mill to Richard Cobden to John Hobson to all those who came later, were making arguments about how liberal democracies should operate, whether they should be working with or against empire, and how far do you go? So you might call them social democratic liberals who emerge in the progressive era, and then again in the New Deal era, and then again in the Great Society era, and more kind of straight down kind of laissez-faire liberals. So I think we're just in that world where the ideas are, there's no settled core, and the arguments among those who are internationalists, who do start the conversation with liberal democracy and what they need to do in the world, and then it opens up and it evolves, and the strands of internationalism get braided together and fall apart. So that's the way I try to grapple with your very important question, which is, it is a huge intellectual and political landscape in which to find the ideas and trace them, their lineages and genealogy across time.
Thank you. Let me hone in on the chapter on empire, if we can talk about that for a moment. And I was struck by what I saw as the extensive credit given to liberal internationalism for inspiring and coming to support anti-imperialism and decolonization. And even if Western democracies didn't live up to the ideals and principles that they preached, once those principles, as you put it, entered into the discourse, they became part of the ideological landscape upon which political struggles are waged, unquote. No argument. The role played by the communist bloc and or communist ideology, granted, this is not your subject in the book, I know, it seems quite minimal in comparison. And so am I reading that correctly? And could one imagine an alternative framing that credits the Soviets and Chinese and other communists for doing as much or even more to inspire and support national liberation struggles, whatever their outcome, than liberal internationalists? If you could just talk a little bit more about the communist role.
Yeah, well, my short answer will be no, but I'll give you a slightly longer answer. I think that my book chapter on liberalism and empire is kind of, on the one hand, liberals have been entangled in arguments for empire, but that entanglement, liberal entanglement with empire, is contingent, to use Duncan Bell's, the intellectual historian's term, not inherent or fundamental, that it's been on both sides. And that chapter is not telling the full story of the movement from empire to nation state, from imperial forms of order to self-determination and state sovereignty in the Westphalian system. So in that sense, it's not telling the Soviet story. But were I to tell more of the Soviet story, I code the Soviet Union as an empire. In the East Bloc was a hierarchical order that didn't have liberal characteristics. It was very different, as Cold War scholars like John Gaddis tell us very eloquently. It had a different form of hegemonic structure that tilted towards empire. Yes, it's true that that the kind of contestation in the third world, you might call it, in the world that was not inside of either the Soviet bloc or the Western bloc, was one where both superpowers were seeking allies and seeking to undermine the affiliations of those states with the other rival blocs. So there's no question, and there's also no question that independent seeking leaders and independence movements in Africa and Asia and elsewhere did tie and define their struggle and frame their struggle in kind of Marxist, communist, national liberation terms. Others didn't. So there is a kind of multiple stories there, and I think you know more about that as a historian than I do. But I think that there really isn't any moral comparison, given the sort of the story of freedom, self-determination, rule by the people, between the Soviet project and we'll call it the American liberal project, beginning with America's founding. and the preamble to the Constitution, to the preamble to the Declaration of Independence, and Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, and the connection of America's identity with this kind of unfolding struggle. I think in the long kind of fullness of history, looks like it has been a more inspiring and consequential bulwark for countries seeking escape from empire than anything the Soviets answered, full stop. And so in so many different ways, from the emergence of Latin American republics in the late 19th century, the efforts of W.E.B. Du Bois, the great American, African-American civil rights intellectual from the first half of the 20th century, he actually tied his hopes on Woodrow Wilson, not Lenin. And the later post-World War II efforts at building more independent authority in the developing world for purposes of pursuing independence occurred through organizations like the Bandung movement that sought to replicate the Atlantic Charter ideals, not Communist Party ideals. So I think I would defend the overweighting, you might say, in the book on those grounds.
Thank you. I would just add that Du Bois ended his life in 1963, very close to the communists. It was a very interesting, political journey that he undertook over the course of the 20th century. We have a question that came in via email, and I'm going to tie it to my last question. And from Herman Cohen, a retired U.S. ambassador, he asks, is it accurate to say that the large disparities in wealth that we see in the US and other Western democracies these days are a reflection of Western capitalism's ability to minimize the majority's desire to share in economic growth? And I would tie this to your final chapter, where you address the rough waters that liberal internationalism has encountered of late. The concept you said is deeply tied to the domestic and social and economic agendas of liberal democracy. But the erosion of progressive coalitions and progressive social policies by neoliberalism, including deregulation and the global integration of capital markets, this has increased inequality in the US and in Europe. This is toward the end of the book. And so at the moment, a reversal of this trend toward inequality doesn't seem to be on the horizon. So if these coalitions remain weak and deep inequality persists, how can liberal internationalism regain the strength that it has lost?
Yeah, that's a great question, and thank you to the ambassador as well. I do think that the conditions inside of capitalist societies today have deteriorated. The rising inequality, and we're really at a generational moment where in many of the certainly Western societies, more generally the kind of advanced industrial societies, the next generation is really going to be the first generation in a long time that won't do better than their parents. So there's a sense of secular kind of stagnation, and I sort of just to underline something you said that I tried to argue in the end of the book, that looking back over 200 years, the best moments for cooperation generally, but liberal international cooperation in particular, was tied to a kind of agenda of progressive domestic movement, whether it was the progressive movement of Teddy Roosevelt and Wilson, the New Deal, the Great Society, even before that in the 19th century, the era of what we often called reform liberalism. I guess you'd have to say that the burden of my argument is that if you don't get a handle on that today, it's going to be very hard to have a fully functioning liberal international order again. I do think that's the weak link, and that's where we need to see some kind of movement. I don't know. I can't quite see how all the pieces will come together to get us to that point. But I do think that what on the international side, what the liberal project needs to do is remind those who are in these conflicts over ideologies and political projects, national and international, that liberal internationalism is not a project of globalizing the world. It is a project for managing our mutual interdependence. And so I would be just as happy if the word globalization never were uttered in the presence of a liberal internationalist. And I would likewise try to suggest that, as I do at the end when I talk a little bit about Danny Roderick's argument about how after a certain point, greater economic integration between states has less efficiency gains and more inequality implications. And so that for every greater increment of integration going forward, we get less of the former, more of the latter. And so it creates more inequality. And we can do a lot. And that in the end, the liberal international project needs to be that as we manage and maybe reassert some government control over building a fairer domestic economy for each of us, that we not pursue a kind of race to the bottom mercantilism, but adhere to some liberal principles like non-discrimination, most favored nation, and multilateral kind of mechanisms for adjudication. So that's not necessarily an answer to your question, but I do think that until we tack back in the other direction, fair tax code, and kind of reassert kind of our and rebuild the kind of the social contract, as I said earlier, making internationalism something that is good for everyday people and everyday problems. That's a slogan, I agree. I don't have a lot of agenda behind it, except that I think serious people are working on it, and new political movements will come along, and young people are thinking about things differently. And in some sense, the crisis that we're in, as in previous crises, in some sense have had to become so acute so that we can actually think once again about first principles. And we may be getting to that point where crazy ideas about the social contract might sound less crazy today as we look to reassert, values of fairness and sharing and mutual assistance.
Thank you. Now let's open this up to question and answers. But first, just a heads up, toward the end of the session, there will be a link for a flyer with purchase information from Yale University Press that will be visible on the screen. So if you're interested in purchasing the book at a discount, keep your eyes open for that flyer, that information. With question and answers, if you could use your raise hand function on Zoom, or if you want to email us, rweekly@historians.org, we will attempt to get to as many folks as we can. There's been a hand in the queue that's been up for a while from Leon Fink. Leon, if you would unmute yourself, you can ask a question. You have to unmute yourself. Bottom left. Okay, work on that. We'll get back to you in a moment. Next in the queue is and forgive me for my pronunciation here, De Lai. If you would unmute yourself, you may speak.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to ask Professor Ikenberry. You said that the word globalization never appeared in the language of liberal internationalists. So I'm wondering, what do you think about the paper titled Globalization, What's New, What's Not, by Bob Kuhin and Joseph Nye?
Well, I didn't say that globalization isn't in the language. It certainly has been. I was trying to say that the ideology of globalization is not something that's brings us closer to the kind of the pragmatic framing of what the project of liberal internationalism is. It's not about globalizing the world. It's about managing our economic and security interdependence. And so it's partly my effort to pull the framing of this tradition back to what I think its core is and what I think it's been when it's been most successful. There are those who have written about globalization brilliantly that in some sense use the language but mean it in the way I do, so that I'm not saying it needs to be extinguished entirely, but it's the underlying concept that I want to emphasize. Professors Nye and Cohen have done path-breaking work on interdependence, and I build on their work and am humbled by what they've done intellectually to illuminate the nature of international politics. So I think that what in particular relating to this book, I think what they and I think several other leading figures of their generation have helped teach us are how to think about interdependence. They coined the term complex interdependence. Others have used the term density, interaction density, ways of trying to get at how our societies are tied to each other and what that means for our common fate. So I guess I would say in the kind of analytic construction of theory about interdependence, that work is very important, and I associate myself with it.
Thank you. We have a question that has come in from Facebook that goes as follows. Do you believe that the post-Cold War era unleashed missionary international liberalism, failed regime change, experiments, sanctions, etc., to its own disadvantage? And is there some way that international liberalism can re-embrace the exemplarist mode, which seems to me Woodrow Wilson had in mind when he intentionally used the passive impersonal construction in his famous speech, "The world must be made safe for democracy"?
Yes, that's part of what I'm trying to do in this book, and to try to remind readers and the public, scholars, that the tradition, the liberal tradition, is not simply a program for military interventionism. And indeed, in my chapter on liberalism and empire, I have a little segment where I talk about the Iraq War, which for some realists, Mearsheimer and others, there's a sense that that's a liberal war. And I dispute that. I think that was really more about great power politics hegemony that was really not a story of spreading democracy, although that became part of the rhetoric for the larger campaign. And I've written about that pretty in great detail with my longtime co-author Dan Dudney. So I just say a little bit about the post-World War, post-Cold War expansion of liberalism. And the implication of the question was that the Cold War ended, the adversaries and the enemies of liberal internationalism and liberal democracy disappeared, and all of a sudden liberals were out pushing their model onto others. It's a little bit more complicated than that. There was a huge amount of demand side movement, integration. Countries were eager for more rather than less integration into this liberal order. People wanted to join the club. Countries from South Korea to Eastern Europe to Southern Europe to Latin America were making various kinds of transitions and wanted to be part of this framework that would allow them to gain markets and mechanisms for assistance and access to the rules and norms of a expanding world economy. So it wasn't simply a missionary story. In fact, I don't think that was the dominant impulse. I think it was as much this kind of sense of there was no other kind of logic for organizing world order in the wake of the Cold War, and this was the only game in town. Yes, there was overreach. Yes, there was an overestimation that the deep forces of modernity would, as Wilson may have thought in his time, envelop the world and move towards a convergence. Indeed, China might well move in this direction. And there was a lot of hope that China would liberalize and integrate and become a stakeholder, to use the phrase of Robert Zellick. And I think it was the right bet to make. And I don't think it was entirely a failed bet. I think that when we think about the alternative, think about the counterfactual, what would you have done if you would have, at the end of the Cold War, begun to build your wall, a Trumpian wall, to leave China on the other side? Would we have a China that would be as willing to tackle problems of global warming as we do today? Would we have a China that would be as willing to tackle non-proliferation goals, refugees, peacekeeping at the United Nations? So China may not be everybody's perfect global citizen. The United States certainly isn't today, but I don't think building the wall at the moment when we were tearing down a wall, the Berlin Wall, would have been the better strategy. Even though you might say the liberal bet was not fully realized yet.
Thank you. Rob, I think you have a question to interject here. We need to unmute you. Hold on. Rob Litvak, are you okay? There we go.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. The eternal question of Zoom meetings, can you hear me? To which the obvious answer is those who cannot hear you obviously will not reply. So, John, just like to probe a little further in terms of where we're at right now. I mean, and this is a group, there are a fair number of historians here. Ernest May and others, talked about like different models for how war started. World War I, inadvertent escalation. World War II, kind of, the Hitler autocratic model of expansion, and now we're into where we're at. It seems, and this is a little preview of a talk I'm going to give on my publication, Managing Nuclear Risks, on Friday, is that we're in a situation where you see both 1914 and 1962 coming into play together. That you've got territorial disputes between nuclear weapon states. I mean, India, Pakistan, Israel, India. I mean, they fought, they had border clashes in 1919, 1920. China has this assertive declaration of sovereignty in the South and East China Sea. These are not kind of peripheral stakes to the Chinese, and where US and Chinese naval forces come into operation. So the 1914 concerns are certain evident there, as well as in Europe, where Russia, for the first time, changed the territorial status quo with the occupation and annexation of Crimea, what it's doing in East Ukraine, hybrid operations in the Baltic states. So you sort of see the 1914 component of it there. And then the 1962 component comes in because the arms control architecture, it's being dismantled. Like the New START treaty is probably, odds are will not be extended. You've got, in a multipolar nuclear system, new states that have not been brought in to any type of arms control architecture. So you have sort of this combination of potential for inadvertent escalation arising from territorial clashes combined with nuclear balances that are not as stable as you would hope they would be in terms of having a mutual deterrent situation. This combination of 1914, 1962 seems pretty, to use the technical social science term, hairy, if you ask me. So what is, I'd be interested in your take on that.
Yeah, well, it sounds like I'm going to have to write another book. So this will be kind of trying to extend some of my ideas. And I guess the first thing I would say is what you describe is frightening, and it is out there at the kind of great power security competition level that is increasing in its intensity and in its danger, whether it's China and its expansionary ambitions in the South China Sea and the worrisome dynamics with kind of erosion of deterrence with of Taiwan across the straits, and then India, China. I think, you know, I don't have solutions that jump immediately out of the book, other than the message that I spend some time just talking about at the end of the book about how do the liberal democratic states deal with illiberal states like China and Russia. And the argument that I make, the historical argument, is that you get all these different alternative ways of trying to deal with illiberal states that may be engaged in security competition with you, to absorb them, to invite them into your club, to seek mutual survival, and then of course on the other side regime change and efforts to turn them into democracies. The liberal internationalists across the last 100 years have made all those arguments. What I think comes most clearly to the surface when we look at the historical record and look how past liberal democracies have dealt with moments like this, and you've mentioned some of the moments, having a kind of a collective sense of leadership and grand strategy in the face of security competition and arms racing, breakdown of arms control. All of that, in some sense, requires us, if we're going to address those problems, to rebuild U.S.-European relations, to stabilize the system of extended deterrence, to relaunch arms control, which is clearly on the other side of this breakdown of order that you're describing. And you know, I think of George Kennan's long telegram. At the end of that long telegram, he makes the comment that is often forgotten, and that is that the struggle with illiberal adversaries who are not likely to immediately come to the table and do deals. The longer struggle is to maintain your own the health and welfare of your own bloc, of your own grouping of states, to keep it legitimate and not to simply mirror the illiberalism of your adversary. So I think the first step is where the liberal internationalists will be most helpful, which is rebuilding coalitions of like-minded states, I talk in the Foreign Affairs article about a kind of D10 of high capacity democracies working as kind of drivers for restarting and rebuilding international institutions and agreements, from climate change to UN reform, to WHO, to arms control. And so having a strong, coherent, mutually respectful grouping of states seems to be where you start. None of the problems you're suggesting, Rob, can really be addressed without that kind of sort of rebuilding of the alignments that will precede diplomacy, and hopefully a kind of a return to reciprocal based arms control restraint.
We have a question that has come in via email, I believe. How does the United States' ambivalent, to be generous, relationship with the ICC, the International Criminal Court, fit into your understanding of liberal internationalism? This from Francine Hirsch, who we'll be hearing from a number of weeks from now when she presents on her book.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I will look forward to tuning in for that, because I want to learn more about from those who have studied it in depth. I guess what I would start with the general point that the U.S. there's kind of again I'm kind of making a distinction between the liberal international tradition and America. So I'm not writing a book about America. This is a book about a tradition that America and other countries have brought into their foreign policy in various ways, never completely and never fully to the exclusion of other impulses, realist or otherwise. So the first point is that the U.S. as a great power has done all sorts of things that look like it, that have fallen into all sorts of different traditions of behavior. Aggressive realism, defensive realism, isolationism, neoconservatism, and liberal internationalism. And the U.S. has been, as I think you're suggesting, ambivalent more generally about tying itself to international institutions. The U.S. has always been a kind of ambivalent institution builder. It wants other countries to adhere to international rules and institutions, while the U.S. gains the benefits from that and only selectively and when it can control the agenda, do so itself. So the U.S. is a kind of paradoxical state where it has done more as a great power across a century to promote a world of rules and institutions, but at the same time been very reluctant, certainly ambivalent about giving up sovereignty and operating inside those institutions. The WTO, it's where it pre-commits to dispute settlement outcomes. It has a record of compliance until recently. So too primarily in trade areas, it's been very reluctant to sign on to the ICC, and of course it's taken its name off, even though it's signed and under Clinton, it had its name taken off. I think John Bolton took its name off the treaty. I think that the liberal internationalism that has thrived over the last 2 centuries has tended to be more intergovernmental than global judicial. There was a kind of arbitration movement in the 19th century that was seen as very constitutive of liberal internationalism that fed into the Wilson era. but it tended to be voluntary. States could bring disputes to tribunals on their own and would accept them if they wanted to. This kind of voluntarist style has fit into the larger American tradition. And just the final thing I'll say about this is that obviously the United States has not been a good citizen in these kind of high law commissions such as the ICC. In some ways, it's been this other kind of slightly weaker tradition of internationalism that has reigned, as I suggested, with arbitration, and with the kind of the epitome of it, I would say, is captured in Elihu Root's tenure as Secretary of State in the period before Wilson, and at the Second Hague Conference in 1907, when the American Secretary of State, who had been the first president of the International Law Association, he wrote instructions to the American delegation to the Hague Convention of 1907. And in those instructions to the American delegates, he said something along the lines of, we are going to try to get agreements on issues that we care about, and we won't get everything we want, but we will establish a kind of working relationship and a baseline that will then be used later on for more agreements. So this kind of ratcheting up, getting used to agreements, socializing ourselves into international legal communities. So it's slightly this more kind of voluntaristic, bottom up, we'll do what we can, but we aren't going to commit ourselves to the point that we will totally rupture our relationship with the outside system of international law. So that's how international relations scholars have tended to try to see both the deep sources of ambivalence, but despite that ambivalence, some kind of ratcheting, small steps, compromise, movement forward.
Thank you very much. And I unfortunately have to draw this event to a close. I suspect we could go on for quite some time this evening, but I want to thank John and Rob, as well as those of you posing questions from the audience, and my apologies to those of you with questions that we could not get to. Stand by on the screen looking for information about the discount code for the book, should you wish to purchase it from Yale University Press. And if you see in the chat function another event, in this case with Rob Litvak and his new book, Managing Nuclear Risks, that'll be taking place this Friday, October 9th at the Wilson Center, and the link to information about that event for registering and RSVPing is there on the screen. The Washington History Seminar returns a week from this Wednesday on October 14th at 4 p.m. Our next installment, webinar installment, which will feature historian Julia Rose Kraut on her new book, Threat of Dissent: A History of Ideological Exclusion and Deportation in the United States. Thank you, everyone. Until our next session, take care and stay safe.